let's talk about something you probably don't think about when you're filling up your car. How a tiny strip of water, literally halfway across the world, could have a massive impact on the price you pay at the pump. You see, Australia has this hidden vulnerability, and it runs right through a major choke point in the Middle East. Okay, let's dive into this. We are talking about the Strait of Hormuz. Think of it as the main artery connecting the oil-rich Persian Gulf to, well, the rest of us. Its location makes it one of the most critical choke points on the entire planet for getting energy where it needs to go. And the amount of oil that flows through here every single day is just, well, staggering. So you can imagine, any disruption here, big or small, doesn't just create little ripples. It creates tidal waves that are felt all across the global economy. And that is exactly why control over this little strait is such a huge point of international tension. So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the geopolitics of this choke point. Then we'll connect the dots directly to Australia's fuel security. After that, we'll explore two possible ways forward, dig into the military angle, and then wrap up by looking at the ultimate choice facing the nation. All right, first up, let's get a handle on the strategic situation. Just by looking at a map, you can see how the geography of the Strait of Hormuz gives Iran some pretty serious influence over this vital passage. Now, Iran's influence here is really a two-sided coin. On one hand, yeah, it could disrupt shipping. But there's also the possibility it could use its control to, as the analysis puts it, basically extort the rest of the world by slapping a tax on any ships passing through. That would raise a ton of revenue to fund its own goals, like its military. The core argument here is that this waterway shouldn't be the plaything of Iran. It has to remain open for everybody. Which brings us to the million-dollar question, right? How does all this high-stakes maneuvering in the Persian Gulf actually hit the wallet of an everyday Australian? Let's connect those dots. And that brings us right to Section 2, Australia's fuel security risk. This is where a problem that seems so far away really hits home. So here's the crucial link. Australia might not be buying its crude oil straight from Iran, but we import a huge amount of our refined fuel, petrol, diesel, and a lot of the crude oil that's used to make that fuel comes from the Middle East and has to get through the Strait of Hormuz to reach the refineries that supply us. We are, as the source material says, buying so much oil indirectly through the strait. And this creates a really serious ethical and financial problem. If Iran started taxing passage through the strait, this quote from the source material puts it bluntly, we'd be funding the IRGC through our purchases. That's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a very powerful and controversial part of the Iranian military. For any democracy, that's a massive, massive dilemma. Okay, so what on earth can be done about this? Well, the first potential path is to look elsewhere, to find new sources and diversify our supply chain. This approach really has a few key parts. First, you've got to work with other like-minded countries to demand free and open passage for shipping. Second, you have to actively go looking for more reliable sources of crude oil that don't rely on the Strait of Hormuz. And that can mean looking at different shipping routes or, as it's suggested here, getting more supply from other places, like the United States. But what if looking outward isn't the only answer? The other path is to look inward. And that brings us to the second big debate, drilling at home and really pushing for energy independence. This quote really gets to the heart of the argument for domestic production. The analysis suggests that with everything going on in the world, there's been a major rethink. The whole idea is that sovereign energy control, being able to power ourselves without relying on others, has arguably shot right up the list of national priorities. So let's just put these two paths side by side for a second. On one side, you have global diversification. That whole strategy depends on international cooperation and, frankly, stability. On the other side, you have domestic production, which is all about using Australia's own natural resources to control our own destiny. It's a classic debate. Do we look outward or do we look inward? And, of course, all this talk about securing shipping lanes and working with partners inevitably leads us to the military side of things. It's not just about diplomacy, it's also a question of military power and what role Australia plays in global security. Which really boils the whole thing down to a very direct question. Does Australia actually have the military gear, the ships, the people, the technology to pitch in and help secure a waterway like the Strait of Hormuz? Well, we don't really have to guess because a recent incident gives us a pretty big clue. The source points out that in 2023, the U.S. asked Australia to send some naval ships to the Red Sea. Australia said no. And the reported reason at the time was a belief that our ships just weren't equipped to defend themselves against the specific missile and drone threats in that area. And all of this brings us to our final section, which really frames the ultimate choice for Australia. Is this a question of sovereignty, or is it actually a question of capability? Now, the principle here is crystal clear. Australia definitely has a strong national interest in keeping places like the Strait of Hormuz open for business. But the final decision to send our military anywhere is, and always has to be, a sovereign choice made by our government and no one else.
But here's the catch, and it's a big one that complicates everything. That sovereign choice isn't made in a vacuum. As this quote points out, it all depends on whether we have available, capable military assets to deploy. I mean, you can't choose to do something if you don't have the right tools to get the job done safely and effectively.
And that leaves us with this final, really provocative question. What good is having the sovereign right to make a choice if your actual choices are limited by what you're capable of doing? That's the central dilemma Australia is wrestling with as it tries to find its way in a very complex world.